Hello and welcome to Cove. My name is Jennifer LaPlante. I'm the Executive Director of DeepSense. And today we are having panel number 5 of a 6-part series where we're exploring minding the gap of technologies for optimization. And today I'm joined by 3 fantastic panelists. But before we begin, we'll do a little bit of housekeeping. The big thing here is we want to ensure we answer questions and explore the things that people are curious about. So if you're watching on a different platform like YouTube or LinkedIn, please feel free to send in some notes or questions. But if you're not logged in, you might have some trouble. So please feel free to send an email to info@coveocean.com, and that will get the questions to us and we'll get them loaded up and we can share. So without further ado, we are going to start by having some great conversations with some key panelists because we want to talk about data infrastructure, software, and services. So we're going to start with Paul Vermette. Paul Vermette is very passionate about data and all things tech. Paul spent a lot of his career in lottery and gaming, and his big world was focused on trying to get more people to use data more effectively. In 2016, he really focused on Power BI and data visualizations and has moved into the analytics and AI practice at Bulletproof, where he helps companies with their data, fuse his expertise with Microsoft data enabling technologies, including data visualization, data analysis, data engineering, and data science. We're also joined by Sherry Murphy, and she's the Senior Manager of Technology at the Halifax Airport, International Airport, or Stanfield Airport, or HIAA, depending on however you want to call it. Sherry has 20 years of great experience in technology focused on infrastructure, support, everything that relates to making organizations tech work. And her background is very broad. She's worked in aerospace, in healthcare, in transportation, and aviation. We're also joined by Sandy Chapman, and he's a senior architect at Lixar. He has a decade of working in a broad range of tech as well as desktop, mobile, and cloud, which we're going to get into quite a little bit today. And he's focused on building applications and data platforms on Microsoft Azure and AWS Cloud. And we haven't done this before, but we're going to do a quick little go around the table. So Sandy, do you want to share a little about some of the stuff that you're currently doing with your clients? Because I think sometimes what ends up happening is we'll get very specific on questions and we forget to talk about what's actually happening today in the real world. So if you want to share a little before we get started, that'd be great.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. Thanks for the introduction, Jen. So what I do at Lixar is I help clients analyze their platform in a couple different areas. They typically come to us with 3 categories of problems. One, they're looking to take some of their on-prem processes and data and move it to the cloud, and they're looking for us to help guide them along the way, as sort of give them a framework for their cloud adoption. So that we can sort of, identify, the cost-benefit analysis for those clients and help them really derive a lot of value out of those migrations. The other ones are sometimes the clients are already deployed in the cloud. They've got a big bucket of data. It might be across different databases. And what we'll often do is apply a data governance framework on top of what they're already doing so that they can, take their existing data that they may have and not be utilizing and help, deliver a high value products on top of that. And then lastly, sometimes what we'll do is we'll build, machine learning algorithms. We'll deploy certain AI practices to sort of derive applications built on top of their data sets that maybe, they haven't thought of or haven't thought of being possible as part of their business.
Very cool. Great breadth of things that you touch on related to software and hardware and infrastructure and data. And we're going to move to Sherry. So Sherry, you're in the different camp than the other 2, where they're more on the consulting side of things. You're helping an organization run, and one that's critical to our ocean sector because out of the airport, we're shipping millions of dollars worth of lobster and other goods. It's a critical, viable pipeline for how we survive as a region. And can you share us a little bit about the things that you're working on from a technology standpoint at the airport?
Yeah, sure. So I'm the senior manager for the airport of technology. And so my role would be looking after anything from servers, kiosks, flight information, any kind of applications or databases. And my role specifically, I would look after the people, the projects, the budgets, and kind of any day-to-day activities that would support the operation.
Awesome. Thanks. And Paul, over to you.
Not to reiterate much what Sandy talked about, because I think Sandy and I do a lot of the same things. But I think to talk about more recent, a couple of things that we've been working with clients on is, and it seems to be a pattern right now, is a lot of them are still dealing with on-prem technology and they want to move to cloud-based technologies like Power BI for visualization, getting away from the older technology, moving also to more what we call a modern data platform versus, some of the data warehousing technology that they've used in the past, and really starting to try to take more advantage too of what I see as some of the commoditization of machine learning and artificial intelligence. One of the other interesting notes, though, that we're dealing with too, and I think this will be an if we get more detailed into it into the chat, dealing with the companies that have a lot of IoT devices. So that's the Internet of Things devices. They've got devices that are out there that are just sending tremendous amounts of data that they want to take advantage of. So we're helping clients there to really show what's more important for the people that want to take advantage of that data versus, just shoving a whole bunch of data in their face and they don't know what to do with it. So it's another challenging thing when you got too much data and what to do with it.
Amazing. So how about Paul, then you kick off and we'll go around the room. Let's start a little bit because you just mentioned a couple things that people often hear about. And I tweeted from the Deep Sense Twitter handle yesterday a bit of a joke where somebody had a fog machine in a server room saying that they wanted, so when people walked into the data center, they'd think they were in the cloud, like it was a cheesy joke. So let's talk then about what does that mean? What does it mean when you're talking infrastructure and going to the cloud first? So Paul, why don't you start us off?
Well, I mean, people look at two different viewpoints from infrastructure. So there's what we call on-prem and cloud. That's the typical two distinctions. On-prem really means that either you're hosting some servers with particular data center company or you have your own data center and you're putting stuff in on that. The cloud, which is kind of an interesting concept, is really what you're doing is you're going to companies like Microsoft, Google, AWS, and saying, I want to take advantage of your data centers that are globally around the world and deploy to those data centers. And they offer various things. One of the things I do like about the cloud versus dealing with my own data center is I could put some simple data and servers on a cloud, and I already know that there's already disaster backup recovery. It's already been certified through various certifications like ISO 27001. So that's a nice thing about the cloud.
Excellent. And so Sandy, what would you say to someone who's trying to figure out the difference between whether they want to manage their own on-premise or on-prem versus thinking about where their data sits in the cloud?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it really comes down to a cost-benefit analysis. You need to look at your own business and your own current IT practices. And usually when people are looking to migrate to the cloud, they're trying to find an alignment between their IT processes and business processes so that they can deliver higher value more quickly. So some of the barriers for that you might want to consider is security, compliance, regulatory frameworks that you need to operate within. Maybe your data needs to live within a certain geographic boundary for whatever reason. Some of these questions come up, and depending on the pros and cons of each, you may want to say, well, maybe we'll want to migrate some of our applications to the cloud, leverage some of the higher order services that those cloud providers give you, rather than just have a bunch of racks in a data center somewhere where you're really managing everything yourself. You're deploying your own applications, and when like Paul had mentioned, you're worrying about disaster recovery, you're worrying about replication, you're worrying about, how many hard drives do I need to replace in the next quarter to make sure that, I've got the reliability I need for my users. So those are some of the big questions when you really want to be considering when you're talking about, do I want to keep my services, my applications on-prem, or do I want to start thinking about migrating to the cloud?
Makes sense. And Sherry, coming from the standpoint where you might be writing the business case and explaining to your executive and your board why you need to migrate, what are some of the things that you might tell them about that might hold you back or hinder you from moving everything over?
Well, I mean, at the end of the day, I think it comes down to the resources that it'll take to manage all of that. When you think about a data center, if you were to replace all of your servers and have it on-prem, you're talking like a massive capital cost. Where if you're going to the cloud, then you're looking at more of an operating cost. So depending upon your organization's cash flow or financial model, some of those become a factor for sure.
That definitely makes sense. And yes, because you have that longer monthly payments or scale up and down payments. We'll go around the room and whoever wants to jump in, maybe Paul, if I said all of a sudden, okay, I've got some servers, maybe it's a laptop no one ever closes the lid on, but I've got something locally that is running where we've got a couple servers running. How long would it take? Can you ever tell someone this is how long it's going to take you to move things to the cloud?
Well, there's with a couple servers and stuff like that, I mean, you could be like a day to a week. It all depends on, if you're still running, say, Windows XP or something like that, that might be challenging. But if you're up to date with stuff, there's a lot of packages, a lot of software that either Azure or, AWS offers to easily migrate your stuff to the cloud. It'll even do some things like if you're moving a database to the cloud, it will tell you like this is going to work, this isn't going to work, and validate that, make sure that those databases will run fine. So I certainly wouldn't stop anyone moving to the cloud. I think what Sherry was alluding to too with related to costs, it's about where you are in your cycle and understanding what I mean by cycle. I mean, have you just purchased those 3 or 4 servers are supposed to last you for 3 years or 4 years? That's maybe not the time that you want to spend money and then have that capital expense. You want to go towards, the last year where your expenses or your what's the word I'm looking for? When you capitalize something, you pay depreciation or you deal with your depreciation, and you want to minimize that as you move to an OpEx model. And,
right.
And that's something that I would tell people too. So.
That makes sense. And I think, we're going to come back to some of this because we're going to get into why all of this matters as it relates to data and IoT, especially in cloud. But let's talk a little about different types of software and services too. So Sandy, you build out applications in some of your world. Can you explain a little about SaaS and SaaS-based? I'm sure most people get it, but let's make sure we're aligned in definition. So how would you explain a SaaS solution to someone who might be tapping into a broad range of different types of services across that entire ocean sector?
Yeah, sure. So there's 3 main tiers when you're looking at, these as a service offerings. Our base tier is infrastructure, which is just, if you've got a VM, you need to manage the operating system, you need to manage the services that run on top of it. The next level up is your platform as a service, which is basically giving you out of the box toolkit for building your own applications and, hide some of the lower level abstractions. You may not know you're running on a specific VM in the cloud or on a data center. You've got a platform you can work with. And then the software as a service on top of that is, you don't need to worry about the underlying platform. You sort of connect it to your data sources. You might have it, have user management built into this solution. And then it offers you sort of the value at the top. So you don't need to worry about building any applications. You just sort of use what's out of the box and is given to you. So usually when you're looking at evaluating them, like SaaS offerings usually aren't a solo offering within the marketplace. You want to compare and contrast the different offerings. And really when you're considering, do I want to go with the software as a solution offering, you need to see, start with what your core business requirements are for investigating that in the first place. See whether it's going to evolve with you as those business requirements may change. And then doing, a comparison with competitors, getting demos from the sales teams and so on to really see if that's going to fit within your business.
That's great. I appreciate that explanation and the multiple tiers too. It's a good visual. Now, Sherry, when you're thinking about making those budgetary decisions as well, or contractual decisions, what do you think about for any type? Are there suggestions or recommendations you give to someone when they're exploring a SaaS contract or SaaS provider?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think Sandy kind of alluded to it, that the devil's in the details in the contract. So, really kind of combing through that. If you have a legal team, have the legal team go through it as well. They've often seen many contracts like this. The other thing to consider is talk to some of their other customers, not necessarily with the vendor or the consultant, but just a one-on-one, get lessons learned, kind of figure out what went well, what didn't go well, what could be improved upon. Often you can figure out some really big gaps in a project if you have a conversation with other customers, a candid conversation. Really, the other thing is on the contract side is how will those costs be impacted? So if you scale up or scale down, what happens? Like, and be very clear about that. Give certain examples and kind of get the vendor to kind of go through that with you.
That's a great point, which we'll get into from a scaling standpoint, because companies can kind of grow and they can grow quickly, or they can scale back because suddenly they don't have a need, especially as it relates to data. And I think, Paul, you touched on IoT devices earlier too. And so you suddenly have one device connected and then you have 100. Suddenly we have some demand that really changes, right?
Yeah.
Is there anything that you can think of too then, Paul, in terms of that we haven't covered off of the considerations for a SaaS engagement?
The biggest thing that I haven't heard yet is also having an exit strategy from the SaaS provider at the beginning, because oftentimes you want to switch and then you find out, for example, it's either going to cost you a lot of money to get your data, or they don't have any easy facility to export your own data that you could move to another SaaS provider. That's probably the biggest lesson learned that unfortunately I had to deal with in my career, and I will never forget that lesson.
That's a good point, because also if you need to get data back, it may cost you a lot more than what you would actually anticipate, thinking that it's yours and you should be able to take it.
I think the other thing that did come to mind too, and I won't mention the name of the vendor, but it was related to like a sales and marketing SaaS tool, and it's like the devil's in the detail, like Sherry was saying. You got to watch out for some of that, because the storage costs, as you accumulated emails and stuff like that, was a tremendous amount of money per month that you didn't realize at the start, because at the start you're not accumulating anything. As you start to accumulate, it's like, wow, I didn't realize it was going to cost that much. So you really got to look out for those hidden costs that are sometimes hidden in those contracts, like Sherry mentioned, so that you're not living through that come like a year or two and your boss is saying, well, that business case doesn't seem to be working out too well.
I will also, if I can just add to that, I sometimes will, and I don't mean it to sound as it does, but I will sometimes go to their competitors and say, why are you better? Because often they will be able to tell you what the other company's flaws are. So even if you're not 100% sure on the topic, I mean, from my standpoint, I'm the one who's usually going to the Sandys and the Pauls of the world and say, hey, I have this problem that I need to solve, but I'm not an expert on it either. So a lot of times you have to trust people, but you have to also do your due diligence with it as well.
That makes complete sense. I love that. One of the questions I did have was data as a service. And I forget, Sandy or Paul, one of you, if you want to jump off, but can you explain a little bit about what this is and what the difference with SaaS and data as a service would be to the layperson?
I'll give that a shot, Sandy, first. Data as a service can be a little overloaded because it means a couple things to a couple different people. Data as a service could mean things like your data storage in the cloud. So data as a service, data lake technology related to that, to be able to store massive amounts of data in the cloud for processing. Data as a service can also mean things like there's third-party data that you can get to enrich your own data. So for example, there might be geographical information, say for I don't know, I'm not familiar necessarily. I'll be honest, I'm not familiar necessarily with the ocean vertical and dealing with ocean data and stuff related to that. But I'm sure there's a lot of third-party data as a service to augment other people's data as they're trying to figure out stuff with related to whether it's ocean current or temperature, or whether there's fish in this area or other things. So that to me is kind of the two areas for me. But
and Sandy, did you have anything else to add?
Yeah, I think so. And I mean, there's a couple different classifications as well. Like you might be thinking about access to live streaming data that you may not be able to get in any other way. So you could think like stock market tickers. There's a big competition for getting those sorts of data services provided to you because it gives you a competitive advantage in the marketplace. Some other data sets are more historical in nature. Maybe you've got data that goes back 120 years. Maybe you're doing some ocean science and you want temperature data, and you've actually got a data set that had people dropping thermometers over the side of the boat, and that's important for you for climate models or whatever you want to predict. So, they're great offerings, and they contrast more and less of what are the applications you can build on top of that service, and more with what are the underlying data. Is it raw? Is it higher order data that gives you pre-built insights? How does it mash up with your own internal data that gives you a competitive advantage in the marketplace? Like that's really where data can really drive innovation within your organization.
And we have a question here from our audience. So for those who are watching, please feel free to post anything on whatever platform you're watching, or flip an email to info@coveocean.com and we'll make sure we get to it. But here's the question, everyone. This is from Susan. So I'm a professional engineer. I'm responsible for understanding the details of data collection and analysis methodologies for all projects. Yet SaaS providers are often not transparent with respect to methodologies. The lack of transparency creates liability and code of ethics issues for registered professionals. Can you comment? So the thought around, some other providers collecting data, but they're not always transparent about what they're collecting. Does anyone have any comments to share on that one?
So is it more a question of sovereignty of data? Like, I want to retain ownership of the data, or is it sort of, maybe they're surreptitiously collecting data that you may not be aware of? I guess I'm sort of questioning the question, I guess, of what's really the motivation?
Well, responsible for understanding the details of data collection and analysis methodologies for projects. So maybe part of it, and Susan, feel free to post a bit more detail too and give us a bit of an example if you'd like. But sometimes you're buying there's a third party that collects data and processes it and gives it back to you, and they're not always clear about how they've processed it, for example.
Maybe they're scraping data that they shouldn't be, or they're not upfront about, which I don't think is legal, to be honest.
No, it's not.
Right.
Just a quick check. Can you guys still hear me? Because I think my video went.
Yeah, I hear you though, don't worry.
I apologize.
Oh, good. So the world of internet. So I think it's one of those things too, where, maybe a bit more detail about the specifics of the data, but that's a good point. I think there's questions around the ethical concerns of it, some challenges. I think, and essentially any kind of data that you're relying on anyone else for, maybe it's the metadata itself that's not clear about what it is that's being provided. But in terms of the data as a service, we were chatting the other day about the data as a service, and sometimes it's you selling your data versus not. So is there anything that you can comment? So let's say I collect data and I want to sell it to some other of my, this one's Zach, sorry about that. We need to know all the details of how the data are collected, but more important is the analysis methodologies, which are not standard. So,
right. So talking maybe about black box algorithms that, they've got higher order analysis done on the raw data. Yeah, so it's kind of hard. I mean, you'll have to ask whoever's providing the data as a service what those processes are. They're opaque. It's definitely a consideration you want to take into account when you're trying to approach that service provider, data provider, to see if you want to actually onboard that. If you do have ethical or legal concerns about it, you'll want to make sure those are clarified before onboarding them. If you're talking about your own data, you can use some data governance practices like data lineage to track the data throughout your own system, so that when you've got customers perhaps coming in and asking you about your data sets, and you're trying to say, yeah, I've got this high level data set that's formed of an aggregate of some other data sets, you can actually trace that data lineage throughout your own system to be able to give assurances to your customers. So it's something when you're designing your own solutions, you should also take into account.
I think the other thing from a data governance perspective, I would state that the big interest in protecting personally identified information is also key. So that's something else. Just if you're getting data from an external source, like Sandy said, want to make sure it's ethically collected and it's legally collected. The other thing too is you want to make sure that you're also compliant with standards. So for example, in Canada, we have the what we call PIPEDA, which is basically a privacy act that is similar to GDPR over in Europe.
Yes, and that's a great segue into our next question then. So when you think about the data needs of a company, maybe I've got a pile of sensors in the water and I have my own data warehouse dealing with that. But there's a pile of other areas where a company might have data as well. So maybe I have social media, I have some digital content, maybe some digital safety, some other challenges. How does an organization figure out where they should put their data or what services they should use? Should you stick with just one vendor? What kind of suggestions can you give for people thinking about the balance of infrastructure and cloud and some kind of a software solution?
So the modern approach to this is something called a data lake. Typically, this is where organizations are trying to centralize a lot of their data infrastructure. So for instance, you might pull in that marketing data, put it into what's called a data lake. You might pull in your operational data, business data, sales data, and you pull it all into sort of a collection of data sets that you store in sort of one or two centralized technologies. So in the cloud, it's often based around, S3 object storage in AWS, or, your Azure storage account. They actually have specific technologies geared towards data lake. It sounds like a complicated concept, but realistically, it's just I'm throwing all of my files into some sort of structured environment, and then having a process and a management plan in place so I can, define the roles that interact with that data, so I can protect certain data from others. So if you've got personally identifiable information, you might have procedures to mask that data, or to have the access to that data be privileged. And really, the idea behind building this data lake is you've got a centralized common standard for the data formats and data access or a standardized way of accessing that data to build your applications and run your analytics and build insights.
I think, Jennifer, if I can just jump on that point, that kind of goes back to what these guys were saying before about the data governance. You can't put the cart before the horse, so you need to have that kind of framework laid out beforehand, because once you have that data going everywhere, it's very hard to kind of backtrack and go, oh, well, hold on, that data over here is private, there's personal information on it. You really have to kind of lay that out ahead of time.
Yeah, and if you do any amount of reading about data lakes, you'll also see this sort of anti-pattern of the data swamp. And that's really
I was about to mention that.
You're trying to build a data lake, and you just throw everything in one place, and you say it's a data lake, we're done with it. But you end up having no curation, no ownership of the data sets. You don't know where the data came from. You don't know who's using the data. You don't have a defined life cycle to say when is this data no longer useful and we can get rid of it. It's kind of, when you're building these data management strategies, it all goes back to planning. You need to define the roles. You need to define, the tiers of your data quality, and you can leverage a third-party partner in helping develop those practices. You can do all the reading and define where the data sets and how they should move through your system internally. But you really need to have a plan in place before you actually start dumping things into a cloud storage account.
Paul, did you have anything you wanted to add there?
No, I just echo that. Governance is so key to have a really good data lake, because you want to keep that water as clear as possible so it doesn't go into a swamp like Sandy was saying as well. So it's I can't emphasize enough, it's so important to have a plan in place on how that data is going to live in that data lake. It's so important.
So with that, let's say I'm not sophisticated enough yet to have a data lake. Okay, so let's go early stage. Maybe I'm a newer company, or maybe my technology skills just aren't quite there and I don't have enough time myself or a team to look at that. If I'm a smaller, medium-sized enterprise, I'm based out of Cove, let's say I'm working in this building, we've got a small team, what's the foundation piece that I should start that can scale? Like, are there mistakes that I could make by accident, or are there things I need to think about as I'm starting to make those initial decisions about where I put things?
I'll take that one. So I've actually been with some companies where you're right, like they either may not want to go to a data lake right away. The key things about understanding is still planning, whether you're storing it within a data lake or you want to mimic that through, say, like a file system, because maybe you don't want to start going into some technology like data lake style technologies. It's still important to plan, and especially if you're dealing with small amounts of data too. It's okay to use things like file systems for a while and stuff like that until it gets either it still meets your needs or maybe it gets slow. What you want to be careful of is make sure you're not putting too much data in there that the file systems weren't meant to handle. So you want to chunk up that data appropriately to make sure. Normally just use CSV files or something like that. It's very simple. It's not complicated. It's the planning around that and making sure your regiment around that that your quality of your data is going to be good and that people understand where to get that data.
Yeah, and I think it's a great point. Like if you're looking at a small medium business, they might have a network drive in their office. They might have a desktop computer that they drop files on. It still doesn't avoid that planning. Like let's say you've got multiple data sets. Well, you're naturally going to make multiple files or folder structures within those. You might segment them by date. So you're already doing that sort of data organization that is completely replicatable on a data lake. It's not a different concept. It's an evolution of an existing concept, and then a set of tooling that supports higher level, processing with that data later on. So if I were a small and medium sized business and I was hesitant about jumping in the deep end with a data lake, I'd be looking at what my plan is in place now for organizing that data, and then how that would migrate to a data lake technology in the future.
Excellent. Sherry?
I'll add to that, just that, and I hate the phrase, you don't know what you don't know, but as somebody who might have a startup that knows nothing about technology or really data, I would say, it never hurts to partner with somebody who is good in that field. Have them kind of lay out those basic framework for you to kind of follow. So there might be a bit of cost going to an organization like that, but it can save you a lot of time and energy down the road. So partnering with a Paul's group per se.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I was just to give you an example. It doesn't need to be a super lengthy process either. Like if your data requirements or you've got a small number of data sets to start with, to come up with this sort of data management plan, it can be on the order of days or weeks to come up with something simple to get started. But the idea is you've got a framework in place that you can expand upon. People can refer to as a source of truth. So it's definitely something that isn't super expensive upfront to do if you were to partner with somebody who can help hold your hand and guide you through the steps.
Those are great suggestions, and I think we all probably could all have one of the what is the worst data storage or file structure, or what are some of those challenges where someone has 12 words in each file name, or lots of underscores and different types of dashes and things like that make it impossible for you to manually program later on. There's lots of really great what not to do's for some simple data structure and data storage suggestions for sure. That's a whole other talk we could have one day about some fun things to avoid. Let's talk a little about the data flow. Paul, earlier you were mentioning IoT devices. So let's say I've got lots of sensors or other types of connected devices or devices that are going to somehow stream information. And I'm trying to figure out my workflow or that flow of data. Is there anything that you can recommend that might help me think about how I set up a cloud or set up a world? Like, how does someone go about even figuring out how they start in the cloud with their IoT devices and start that data flow?
Well, the examples I can tell you about is Microsoft related, because that's mostly what I deal with. However, there's other companies that definitely have similar offerings like AWS and Google and other companies. But say for Microsoft, for example, they already have in the cloud, they already have things like their IoT hub. And that IoT hub has even device profiles that if you already have existing profiles that are even in their IoT hub and define, is simply allowing them to connect to those devices out in the cloud. One of the things that we're finding with IoT devices, though, is the bandwidth usage and just the sheer amount of data that's out there. So if you have many devices, something that's coming up, if you're in the field of the IoT devices, something that is coming up is more around edge computing now for IoT devices. So you can put these edge services by these IoT devices that even have embedded machine learning or artificial intelligence, depending upon if there's stuff that they can localize before sending to the cloud, because the companies are understanding about the sheer amount of bandwidth some of those devices could take. So I think the biggest thing is look for something that allows you to connect your IoT device right away if it is a defined device, and then understand what you want to do and how much data is going to be transferred, because the more data you transfer, that's where the costs from the cloud come in. So you got to balance that with, yes, I want that data because it's valuable, to I don't want to pay for that, maybe not send so much data.
Right. And for that, thank you. And Sandy, one of the things we also talked about, I know you've lots to add on too, offline and online devices too, and that kind of surge you might have in some other pieces. What other thoughts do you have of companies trying to set up the IoT or other types of devices as they're thinking data flows?
Yeah, handling sort of unstable internet connectivity is a very common problem in IoT. So to Paul's point, putting as much business logic, as much smarts on the device as possible is really, really key. So if you can say, well, with my sensor network over the next 6 months, I want these certain devices to be giving me these sorts of insights, rather than pulling all that raw data up into the cloud and doing your processing there, discarding the data you don't need, picking the features you do, you can actually push that logic down to the device. And as Paul mentioned, on Azure, you've got IoT Hub, computing at the edge for that. On AWS, they've got Greengrass for doing the similar sorts of things. So it's when you start leveraging some of the cloud services on top of just the basic infrastructure, you can really sort of deliver a lot of value very quickly when it comes to doing things with IoT. So you don't have to write your own firmware. You don't have to write your own, business logic that is able to pull down and do dynamic behaviors on the device. You can do all that upfront with the cloud services, with a platform that provides that.
Awesome. Fantastic. And I think, there's always definitely people get scared, and where Sherry earlier was talking about the difference too between your OpEx and your CapEx. I think it's one of those things when you have to start paying for every minute on your cell phone versus an unlimited plan, it's that whole mental, oh my goodness, you're willing to pay for it first if there was a set cost. But then sometimes when you scale up and down on those storage costs and other pieces come in, it has you rethinking your needs.
Yeah, I was gonna add to that. So especially if you have these devices in remote areas, right? So if you're dependent on a cell service and you're not 100% sure the amount of data that's going to be pushed or pulled, it can really bite you. You may not even realize it until it's too late.
Absolutely, without a doubt. So one of the things I'm just looking at, one of the questions that we talked about before, and I'm sure you're all going to have some great examples, but can we talk a little about some of the applications and data applications or some cloud services or software that you all experience or love or recommend others to look at? So Sherry, I know that, well, without giving things away, I've seen some of the things that at the airport they use, but can you share a little about some of the software? I think Tableau might be something that you've dabbled in there, but what kind of software do you use that you would recommend or at least have experience with that you could talk about?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the really critical pieces of applications that we use is Tableau. So it's a enterprise service bus that allows us to move data from one application to the other. And we do this these integrations with, I don't know, probably a dozen different applications. So without that, we would be missing gaps in our infrastructure within our operation. So being able to move baggage information from the baggage drops to the different carriers and getting replies back. I mean, it's the enterprise service bus are really, really critical for our operation.
Excellent. And I know some companies aren't always large enough for that world, but some are, and there's smaller scale versions you can build. But also, Tableau, can you share a little too about your experience with getting users to explore and use and try using Tableau?
Yeah, I mean, I think for the airport, we've really been focusing. That's how my role came about, actually, was that my predecessor got moved over into this data and analytics role. So we've been really focusing on trying to get the organization to understand the importance of the data. I mean, I think everybody would agree that your data is probably one of your biggest assets, but making the different departments within the organization realize that data that they have can impact the other departments over here. So we went through an exercise not that long ago where we basically sat down with every single department to kind of understand what their data was, to try to draw those synergies between the departments. And it was eye-opening for a lot of the organization, because they didn't realize the data that we had they needed. So it seems very simple, but a lot of times you really have to draw those synergies back to say, you know, we could be helping you meet your objectives with the data that we have. So trying to centralize it and make sense of it all.
It's fantastic. And I think it's one of those experiences that companies, regardless of size, can all benefit from. It's the same thing as trying to build out the governance that, you know, Sandy and Paul were touching on, of trying to get some structure and organization and planning in place. It's the same thing with leveraging, actually using the data as part of that life cycle. So Sandy, you know, I feel like I might be able to guess what your answer is going to be, but what are some of the software or solutions or applications that you think companies should really kind of try to explore or dabble in or try or invest in?
Yeah, I hope I'm not going to steal Paul's answer, but I really see Power BI as a really good tool for people, one, to sort of explore a bit of their data. You know, if you've got existing workflows based around Excel, well, you can import that into Power BI and start visualizing that in a more digestible way. You might get used to publishing those Power BI reports for other users rather than sharing Excel files around. So that's really a great way for small organizations to sort of get an idea of some of the data tools that would be, you know, leveraged for consumers of the data. On the other side, if you're dealing with a lot of big data, I'm a huge fan of Spark and the whole Spark-based suite of tools. It's really meant for distributed data processing of extremely large data sets, relevant to the sort of the oceans-based domain. There's a lot of geospatial data that you can do. Spark has a framework called Apache Sedona. It's also known as GeoSpark. It does an excellent job of allowing you to analyze very large geospatial data sets. So I love dealing with this and sort of taking all these data sets, such as a bunch of tables, and then doing a bunch of interesting joins, and then being able to graph that on a map. I think it's really, really interesting way of dealing with your data and visualizing it.
And that's critical in the ocean sector. Geospatial data is huge and plenty. And so knowing the different types of software that can be used. So yeah. Paul, was that going to be your answer as well? Was it Power BI?
Power BI, definitely.
So
just
Paul,
to emphasize too.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Jen.
Can you give an explanation of what Power BI is?
So Power BI is in a category of tools that I would equate to a visualization tool that allows you to analyze data. So you have from KPI visualization down to drill throughs to get understanding what's going on in your data. But it's all visual, which I find is better than looking at pivot tables. And I know there's those Excel warriors out there that still love Excel, and Excel, of course, is still the #1 business intelligence tool of the world. But Power BI, just even to get started, is free. Of course, Microsoft does want you to get hooked, but the price point of the tool itself too is pretty cheap compared to its competitors. Competitors would be things like Click, Tableau, And that would be, if you're familiar with those names too from a visualization perspective, that'll give you an idea what Power BI is. Emphasize on what Sandy's talking about. One of my new favorite pieces of software, because I got excited back in 2016 with Power BI because I thought Microsoft hit it with the combination of the right amount of features with the right cost. But Databricks, which kind of augments what Sandy was talking about with Spark, but Databricks offers a complete environment that's both available on AWS and on Microsoft, which I think they did a great idea here, where companies made investments to make Databricks so they can offer it in multiple environments. And that allows an integrated environment for all like your data scientists, your data pipeline, your data engineers, get access to your data lake, have that data lake set up properly from, having your high quality data set, your gold data sets that, people are consuming, and that can tie right into Power BI for your visualizations.
So we'll have to decide which one of you is going to take this one on, Sandy or Paul. But the question is, how does Power BI compare with Matlab? Most Ocean people tend to know a combination of Fortran, Matlab, Python, R. I see a lot of researchers that know R. So what would be your comparison from a Matlab world versus Power BI?
You want to take that, Sandy?
Yeah, sure. I think Paul mentioned the biggest advantage. So Matlab and R, you're learning how to really program. You're massaging the data sets manually. What Power BI gives you is sort of a visual interface for joining those data sets, filtering them, applying transformations, without having to really write a whole lot of code. Sure, you might have to write a SQL select if you're dealing with a SQL database or something like that to get the right data set you want. But it really gives you a lot more approachable way for I guess I wouldn't say non-experts, but maybe subject matter experts who may not be as technological for exploring that data. So it's sort of a more democratizing tool than having to learn how to do matrix transformations in R or something like that. That's really where I would see the big advantage for something like Power BI.
The difference though too is that R and Matlab also has the ability to do some of those algorithms and calculations too and stuff like that. So I would split Power BI into two things. Like I said, data prep, which is just easier. So I would prep my data using Power BI technology, then run R or Matlab or other tools in order to analyze that data. And then I would output from that and use Power BI to visualize it.
Yeah, I think really Matlab and R are tools for data exploration, and there are a lot of like platforms or frameworks built on top of those for I want to generate a nice website to host my R code and show all the graphs that I've been working on. But Power BI dashboard gives you a lot more dynamicism. You can hook into data sources live. You can load data periodically into Power BI dashboard, so it can give you a more operational look on your data that may be more useful for business users.
So Jen, I just wanted to jump in because when you asked the question originally, I thought I heard TIBCO, which is why I went to the enterprise service bus. But we are running Tableau, and I know that we have dabbled in Power BI as well. When it comes down to the user adoption, I wouldn't say that that has been it's probably been slowed on the uptake. I think we have certain people who are data focused who have an interest in it, but I think we still have a bulk of the users who look at it as it's a bit daunting. That's an IT function when really it's not necessarily an IT function. But both products actually work quite well.
And that's a great point too, because it's I would think Matlab too might be somebody who's massaging, working with, analyzing the data versus I think Paul, you could probably share a little about trying to roll out a Power BI across an organization that you're working in, right? And you're trying to get users to adopt and learn how to use data differently, that they're not necessarily doing any analytics. You just want them to take insight from the data that's being presented to them.
Yeah. I think what I find in a lot of places is there's a lot of effort to generate the reports, actually make decisions. And that's one of the reasons why you would bring something like a Power BI or Tableau tools to say, I don't want people spending their time trying to generate the report so they can finally make a decision. I want to present them with the reports that they can make the decisions right away and use their other time to work on strategy and other things. I've been so many places where I see 160,000 line spreadsheet with VLOOKUPs in Excel, and I'm like, I just scratch my head, and I'm like, it's what they're used to. It works, but did you know there's maybe an alternative way that would help you out better? A lot of copy and pasting, like people would spend 20% of their week copy and pasting data from various reports because they don't know how to integrate and automate that. Those are perfect use cases for technologies like Power BI and Tableau and those type of tools as well.
Change is hard, right? So if you've done it in Excel your entire career, and then somebody walks in with this new fancy technology, it's very hard to get the Excel warriors, I think you refer to them as, to be able to change and adjust.
Totally. It's all change management.
Yeah. One of the just as kind of a tail end of this discussion, one of the I'll just float again. I love Power BI. I think everyone knows me that knows that I love Power BI. But one of the things I stress about Power BI is there's two technology within Power BI. One's called DAX, which is the data analytics expression language, and one's called Power Query. Power Query is what we call the data prep language. That means I want to connect to something, I need to manipulate it, I need to merge some data together. That's Power Query. And then there's a data analysis expression language, which is used to create measures. So I want sales year to date, I want sales margin ratios, whatever you're interested in. The cool thing about that is whether I can use that in Excel or Power BI. So if I know those technologies, I can transfer those skills from Excel to Power BI, or just use Excel maybe in a more efficient way than using a lot of the. I always pick on VLOOKUP, so instead of using VLOOKUPs.
Well, what's really funny is my last question was going to be, what is your data system application, whatever pet peeve? So Paul, maybe yours is going to be VLOOKUPs.
Yeah, VLOOKUPs is one of those things or people trying to deal with data that's even larger than, say, like an Excel sheet can handle, like more than 1 million rows.
Yeah.
It's just, I don't think you're using the right tool at that point, or at least Excel can handle it. You're just not using it maybe in the best way to handle that amount of data within Excel. So that's kind of one of my pet peeves for sure.
It's a good pet peeve. Sherry, do you have an infrastructure data software pet peeve?
Well, I think one of my biggest pet peeves that kind of relates to all three sides is that you can set it and forget it. So people have this data and they don't think, once they put it there that, well, that's not mine. That's been there for 20 years, even though it may belong to their department, that's an IT function. When we don't understand necessarily what that data is, what it's for, the importance of it, because it's not classified, it just kind of gets dumped there. Same idea on the infrastructure side. So, I don't know how many times I've had the conversation with executives. They're like, well, we just upgraded that. Well, what do you mean you have to replace that already? Or what is this licensing for? I mean, we already spent a ton of money like 3 years ago. So the whole idea of, once you buy it once, you can just kind of walk away from it doesn't exist in IT. But often senior executives may believe that as part of their understanding. So it's one of the things that kind of haunts me no matter where you go, no matter what industry you're in, no matter what executives you deal with. It always seems to be the same. Once you've done it, you should be able to walk away from it. And there's no such thing.
I'm going to come back.
It's what I refer to as the care and feeding.
Yes. Yeah. We're getting back to that. I want to hear what Sandy's is, but let's come back to Sherry's in a second. Sandy, what's yours?
Yeah. So one of the things that I always makes my skin kind of crawl is when I see, these houses of cards built by hand. I'm a big proponent of automation. And sometimes you come into an organization and everything's been done manually. I've built this application, I've manually deployed it, I manually configure it, I manually stand up the servers. And then if anything ever goes wrong and breaks, you're spending days fixing it or trying to recover it. So I'm a big proponent of automation, and it sort of applies to all three domains. Automate your data workflows. So if you're applying the same sort of transformations or data cleaning processes, joins, automate it, build a data pipeline, use some of the tools that are available to sort of make that job easier so that you can be hands off. You do it once, you monitor it to see if it's successful or not, and then you let it go. It's the same thing with infrastructure. In cloud environments, infrastructure as code is a big pattern that's heavily promoted. Instead of going into the cloud environment and clicking buttons and setting things up, you write a bunch of code. That code is able to deploy your infrastructure so that if anything breaks, well, it's running the script again to redeploy it and recover your environment. So yeah, that's probably my big pet peeve is seeing things built by hand rather than understanding the value that automation can bring.
It's amazing because I think it's a good reminder it all fits together, because it's that the whole concept of the capital versus OpEx expense too, but in the care and feeding that you've bought it, but it's still going to need to either grow. Someone needs to support it. Someone needs to ensure there's adoption and governance. And I love those parts too, Sherry, about it's not really my data, and the discussion over who owns what data, who's responsible for it, who actually makes sure that someone derives real value from that data. And that's a tricky part. If you're just used to that operational piece and it tells you whether or not something's working or not, yes or no, it's really hard for you to make some great value out of that data.
I think the other challenging thing is that there's not enough education on the user standpoint. So from their perspective, they're just doing their job. They need this data. They just dumped it over here. Yeah. Where, again, I think you guys refer to it as a swamp, a data swamp. Well, on-prem stuff can become a data swamp as well. So it's a struggle.
Yeah, I think anyone who's shared a shared network drive understands what a data swamp is when people just start dumping everything into some folder somewhere. Yeah.
But I think the challenge with data and data ownership, it's similar. It's everyone uses the data, and it's more of an enterprise asset. I'll give you an example. We know probably who would own a marketing and sales application. We probably would know who would own a financial application like your general ledger, APAR. When you talk about, well, who owns the data, it isn't that someone ultimately owns the data. It's that people own parts of the whole data ecosystem. And really what IT is trying to facilitate is being that steward to those various people that should take ownership of their data, and then help them work together to see if they can get better value by combining that data together. That's the key, I think, personally.
It is for sure. And I think some of the challenges with larger organizations that have been around for 30, 40, 50 years is that there was no governance or structure in the beginning. So you're left with stuff all over the place and nobody really understands it. Everybody's frightened to death to get rid of it. There's no sort of retention policies. Often there's maybe even stuff you can get rid of, but nobody will pull the trigger on that because it's not theirs. It's not theirs to get rid of.
Right.
And so when you move to a pattern like a data lake, oftentimes people look at adopting a data catalog, which sort of classifies these data sets. You can apply metadata such as ownership. You can apply lifecycle policies to them to automatically archive old data or delete it. I think that's really, when you're talking data governance, a data catalog is an important part of those sorts of structures.
The metaphor I like to use sometimes too around dealing with data and the storage of data is, if you have a bookshelf in your room, there's only so many books that you can put in there. So I agree that data, yes, is cheaper for storage and stuff like that. But there comes to a point when it's like, okay, do you really need that 15-year-old piece of data that's there? First of all, is there a legal reason why you need it? Is there a business reason why you need it? Well, maybe you don't need it. Keep room. Keep your shelves clean. Keep a little bit of room for new books. Check it every once in a while. That's the metaphor I like to use for people, because they just don't understand. Like, I got 7 terabytes of file shares that no one's touched in 2 years.
Right.
Yeah.
That might be my second pet peeve. Like, oh, well, storage is cheap. Who cares? Why can't we just leave it?
These are brilliant lessons to end on when we talk about going to cloud, moving to cloud, things you need to clean. It's like when somebody moves their house, they throw away a bunch of things. So maybe it's a good time to do some inventory of their own data as they reconsider software, infrastructure, hardware, etc. I want to thank you, all three of you. This has been fantastic and a super great discussion that I know we could all talk about for the next couple of hours. But thanks to everyone who is listening, and I look forward to seeing you in the next session. And thank you, Sandy and Sherry and Paul.
Thank you.
Thank you.